بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وبعد. So last week we covered the first section of the purification process في طهارة الخبث, so removing the literal tangible impurities. So we looked at that which is used to remove, the process of removing, and that which should be removed from the body, etc., from the body, place of prayer, and the clothing. And now we've come to al-Qism al-Thani fi taharat al-Ahdath. So the second section, which Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah uses to discuss purification from ritual impurities, so non-tangible impurities, states of being impure. And we're not going to go into the details. We're not going to cover everything that Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah has mentioned. Why? Because it's not a fiqh class. The purpose of this class is not for fiqh. The purpose of this class is purification of the heart, the soul, etc., and looking at some of the aspects that are sometimes overlooked in worship, ihsan, suluk. So I will mention, inshallah, each particular part and just maybe briefly give a little introduction without mentioning what al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala radi'an has mentioned. So he says, fi taharat al-ahdath, the purification from ritual states of impurity. So what are the ritual states of impurity? Basically you have al-hadath al-asghar and al-hadath al-akbar. So minor state of ritual impurity and a major state of ritual impurity. And how is it that a person enters into a minor state of ritual impurity? By that which nullifies the wudu. So for example, using the bathroom, for example, excessive amounts of blood, and the fuqaha, they differ on what an excessive amount of blood actually is. For example, sleeping, loss of the mind, and so on and so forth. When I say loss of the mind, i.e. loss of consciousness through something similar to sleep, fainting, loss of sanity, various things that are studied in more detail when looking at a framework of fiqh. So he says, منها الوضوء والغسل والتيمم ويتقدمها الاستنجاء. So he mentions the means of purifying from those states. As mentioned, the minor and the major would be the state that a person enters into after being intimate with their spouse, or for the sisters completing the menstruation cycle. So a person will perform wudu for the minor state of ritual impurity, and ghusl for the major state of ritual impurity, so sometimes referred to as ritual bathing or showering, etc. And tayammum in the absence of water, or even if the water is present, the person is unable to use the water due to, for example, it could be they have some sort of condition, their skin, or they have the fear that if they were to use the water, they would become sick, or perhaps the water is in front of them, but they're unable to access the water due to some sort of harm that might be between them and the water, etc. And then he says, وَيَتَقَدَّمُهَا الْإِسْتِنْجَاء, and prior to wudu, ghusl, and tayammum, a person must perform istinja, so cleaning oneself after using the bathroom. So he starts with آداب قضاء الحاجة, the etiquettes relating to relieving oneself in the bathroom. So when the Muslim uses the bathroom, there are etiquettes. There is a protocol that should be followed. As I'm sure most are aware of, entering with the left foot, seeking refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from that which may be harmful within the bathroom, and the basmalah before removing clothing, and so ideally prior to stepping into the bathroom. And generally speaking, we as Muslims should have a high standard of hygiene, practices. We clean ourselves with water. We don't leave anything behind when we use the bathroom. Unfortunately, some, they use the bathroom and they leave urine in the toilet area, or they leave other things in the toilet area. And even worse than that, sometimes, if that's happening in a masjid, in a house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you wouldn't treat your own house like that. You wouldn't treat your mother's house like that, your father's house like that, etc. So how can you treat the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in such a way where you're using the bathroom and you're leaving urine on the floor, or you're leaving feces on the floor, etc. My apologies for mentioning these things. Leaving blood and it's unacceptable behavior. And if anyone sees that this has been left behind by someone else, they should remind them in the best of ways. And we should teach our children to respect the houses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and respect our own houses, and to respect ourselves. We are ambassadors and representatives of Islam, and our hygiene standards are representative of the standards of Islam to those that do not know Islam. To those that do not know Islam, they will look to Muslims and they will judge Islam based upon the Muslims. And so we have to stick to the high standards that the Prophet ﷺ came with. So he mentions certain etiquettes and adab. And when you go through the books of fiqh, some of the ulama, they will comment that some of the fuqaha, they mention certain practices which are in fact perhaps slightly extreme, and they can lead to waswas and intrusive thoughts and things like this. Then he goes on to kayfiyatul wudu, the way in which a person will perform wudu. So if a person has performed istinja, they've cleaned their private parts using water, etc., then they would perform their wudu if they've broken their wudu, or ghusl if they've entered into a major state of ritual impurity. And the kayfiyah is mentioned, so just a general kind of overview of what's agreed upon. Washing the hands, the ayah, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu idha qumtum ila salati faghsilu wujuhakum, etc., to the end of the verse. Everything in that verse is agreed upon by the fuqaha. So washing the hands, washing the face, wiping the head, washing the feet. The difference between the ulama, the fuqaha, is up to what's included, the amount that needs to be wiped, etc. But generally speaking, they all agree upon washing the hands, the face from hairline to chin, ear to ear, the arms from fingertips to elbows, wiping the head. They all agree that the entire head should be wiped, but they differ on what the bare minimum is. They agree on the neck being wiped, the back of the neck. It's the opinion of the Ahnaf, the opinion of the Shafi'iyah, and a riwayah, an opinion in the Hanbali school. Imam Ahmed has an opinion attributed to him. The Malikiyah, I'm not sure, to be honest. Washing the feet, extra care being paid attention to the heels, and washing above the ankles, etc. And likewise, there is a consensus of wiping over the khuf, the leather sock, to such an extent that some of the fuqaha, some of the ulama considered it to be an article of creed, to some extent, theology. That if a person denies that one can wipe over the khuf, the leather sock, or its like, then this is something which could potentially negate one's Islam. Why? Because the evidences for wiping over the khuf, the leather sock, are so large in amount that it's impossible for a person to negate the sunniyah of wiping over the leather sock. As for wiping over cotton socks, there's a difference of opinion. There's a contemporary opinion that it's permissible to wipe over cotton socks, the thin ones, etc. But the fuqaha of the past, the Ahnaf, the Shafi'iyah, and the Hanabila, they would agree that it has to be a khuf, or that which meets the conditions of the khuf, i.e. it's thick, the water does not permeate through the sock, it can be walked in, it's above the ankles, etc. So if a person can avoid wiping over thin cotton socks, they should. If they can, they should. And again, maybe that's going into too much detail, because we said we're not going to go into the detail, but that's a general overview of what the fuqaha, the ulama, have agreed upon. So then he mentions fadilatul wudu, the virtue of wudu. He says, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من توضأ فأحسن الوضوء وصلى ركعتين لم يحدث نفسه فيهما بشيء من الدنيا خرج من ذنوبه كيوم ولدته أمه. That the person who performs wudu, and he فأحسن الوضوء, he performs it to the best of his ability, to the best of his ability. The Prophet ﷺ, he didn't mention, that he perfected the wudu. Ahsana means he does it to the best of his ability. Al-ihsan is to do something to the best of your ability. And that's important to note, because if a person tries to perfect something that you cannot perfect so per se, then it can lead to intrusive thoughts, waswas, etc. But they do their best. And then they perform a prayer, 2 units of prayer, two rak'ah. They don't speak to themselves within that prayer about anything relating to this dunya. The reward of doing that is that they will have their sins forgiven for them, and they will be just like the state that they were born into, i.e. clean, pure of sin, the day that their mother gave birth to them. And now the ulama, they would mention that this is in relation to the minor sins, as there's a general opinion that the major sins require specific tawbah for that which we can remember. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from major sin. So that which we can remember, we have to make specific tawbah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for. That which we can't remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Ghafur and al-Rahman, as long as we've changed our ways and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to generally forgive us, bi-idhnillah, Allah will forgive us. And tawbah, on that point, there are conditions, and Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentions it in various places. The most important is to leave off the sin. There's no tawbah for the one that doesn't leave off the sin. I can't engage in a sin and say astaghfirullah and then say to myself, I'm going to do it again tomorrow. I drink and I say astaghfirullah, but I'm intending to drink again tomorrow. That's not tawbah. That's not tawbah. That's mockery. If I have an issue with a certain sin, that's different. If I have an issue with a certain sin where I'm trying to stop the sin but I keep falling into it, but I'm genuinely trying to stop the sin but I keep falling into it, that's different. And there's a hadith the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned, he was questioned about a person who continues to sin, and the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned that there is a person who will sin and seek Allah's forgiveness, genuine tawbah and istighfar, and then fall back into the sin again, and then genuinely turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then fall back into the sin again, and then genuinely turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to his angels, bear witness, I've forgiven this person for the sin and for everything of wrong that this person has done. Why? Because of the fact that the person is struggling and fighting and striving against himself. And that's the nature of man, that's the nature of life. Life is a struggle against the self. And so a person who has this idea that a righteous Muslim is a Muslim free of sin doesn't understand what it means to be human. The amount of sin may decrease, but sin will be there. And some of the ulama, they mention that these sins of the awliya are basically disliked acts. They're disliked acts. A person can get to a stage where they've left off all types of sin other than unavoidable, disliked acts, etc. Perhaps, but that takes time. And if we look at the time that we're living in today, we're living in a time where it's so easy to sin. It's so easy to sin that sometimes we may not even realize we're sinning. We might not even realize. How many naked images do we view without considering the fact that I shouldn't be looking at this? How many things do we listen to without considering the fact that I shouldn't be listening to this? Online drama, backbiting, namima, and so on and so forth. How many times do I judge a person without realizing I shouldn't be judging them? I shouldn't have negative thoughts about others and assumptions, etc. And the list can go on. So the point being that as long as that which I'm aware of, I'm asking Allah to forgive me, that which I'm unaware of, Allah is al-Rahman, al-Ghafur. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he says, al-Ghazali, he mentions, وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام ألا أنبئكم بما يكفر الله به الخطايا ويرفع الدرجات. Should I not inform you of that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses to forgive you of your sins and raises stations of people. إسباغ الوضوء على المكاره ونقل الأقدام إلى الصلاة وانتظار الصلاة بعد الصلاة فذلكم الرباط 3 مرات. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, إسباغ الوضوء, basically to perform one's wudu and perfect one's wudu when it might be difficult to do so. When it's difficult to do so, perfecting one's wudu, etc. وَنَقْلُ الْأَقْدَامِ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ, and walking to the prayer, and waiting for the prayer after the prayer. So remaining in the masjid, waiting, for example, from Dhuhr until Asr, Asr until Maghrib, Maghrib until Isha. But of course, this is for the one that doesn't have responsibilities during those times. A person who has to provide for his family should not be waiting around in the masjid saying, yeah, I'm doing ribat. No, you're doing something which is wrong. You have a family to provide for. You shouldn't be sitting in the masjid if you have a family to provide for. If you can't provide for the family, why get married in the first place? So it's perhaps something that's misunderstood by some. And then he says, وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام من توضأ فأحسن الوضوء ثم رفع طرفه إلى السماء فقال أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله فتحت له أبواب الجنة الثمانية يدخل من أيها شاء. The one who performs his wudu and he performs it to the best of his ability and then looks to the heavens and testifies, as you just heard, أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا رسول الله, the slightly elongated version. All of the doors of Jannah are open for this person. He can enter into any of the doors of Jannah, the gates of Jannah, that he so chooses. So this is all just from what? Wudu. All just from wudu. And sometimes we're lazy with our wudu. We're lazy. Look at the reward of performing wudu. And another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, everyone knows, he asked the Sahaba, how would you, what do you think about a man who has a stream of water running in front of his house? He has to clean himself in it 5 times a day or something along those lines. And the Sahaba said, at the end of the day, he will be extremely clean. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, that's like the salah for your dhunub. So if you were to perform wudu and then perform salah, look. But shaitan, the trick of shaitan is what? Oh, you sinned. Don't pray. You didn't pray Fajr. Don't pray Dhuhr. Makes us feel lazy sometimes. And the nafs as well. We have 2 enemies, the external and the internal. So the wudu is important. And the virtue of wudu is great. And this is what? 2 or 3 ahadith about the wudu. But there are books authored on the wudu. The miswak alone. The Prophet ﷺ said, مُطَهَّرَةٌ لِلْفَمْ أو مُطَهِّرَةٌ لِلْفَمْ مَرْضَاتٌ لِلْرَبِّ. Something that cleans the mouth and pleases al-Rabb, the Lord, just by cleaning the mouth. So hygiene, purification physically and spiritually is very important in Islam. And as we said, Islam came for the spiritual purification of the heart and soul. Then he says, كيفية الغسل, so how to perform ghusl. So ghusl, ritual bathing or showering, etc. Basically, the bare minimum is that every part of the person's body needs to be washed. Every part that is apparent needs to be washed. Yeah, so hair, the water has to reach the roots. The water has to reach the roots when performing ghusl. And al-madmada and istinshaq have to be performed in the ghusl according to the Ahnaf and the Hanabila. And the Shafi'i, if I'm not mistaken, they don't make it a condition. But in it's always safer to follow the more cautious opinion in fiqh, generally speaking. Al-khuruju min al-khilaf mustahab, an opinion which is generally agreed upon by the fuqaha, that to take yourself out of contentious space in fiqh, differences of opinion, is recommended. It's recommended according to the Hanabila and the Ahnaf and the Shafi'iyya. So ghusl, it's the bare minimum is to wash the entire body. That's the bare minimum. If a person is intimate with the spouse, or a lady finishes her menstruation cycle, or they emit seminal fluid, man or woman, for whatever reason it may be, whether it's due to physical contact with their spouse or due to a dream, whatever it might be, then the person must perform ghusl. And this is something which needs to be taught to our young, because there are many young brothers, young sisters that don't realize they have to perform ghusl. They don't know that they have to perform ghusl, and they're not informed, they're not taught by their parents. Many Muslim parents do not speak to their sons and their daughters about, for example, wet dreams, menstruation cycle. There are many young Muslim girls, their parents do not speak to them about the menstruation cycle. And perhaps today it's easier in the day of social media, they're going to be exposed to things and there will be a general awareness. But previously, there were incidences where sisters would start their menstruation cycle and wouldn't know what was happening to them. Why? Because their parents hadn't informed them, hadn't sat down and spoken to them. That's not correct. If you feel shy, take them to someone who can speak to them about these things. Likewise, young men and having wet dreams. It's something which needs to be spoken to. you don't have to directly speak to the young person, but teach them that this can happen, and if this happens, then this is what needs to take place, i.e. ghusl. Why? Because their salah is going to be invalid if they're praying in that without performing ghusl, having a shower. And some of the fuqaha, they would say, even if they did have a shower, let's say they had a shower to clean themselves, but they didn't make the intention for the ridding of the hadath, then the shower wouldn't count. They would still have to have another shower, perform another shower to pray. The Ahnaf don't make that stipulation, but it's important. Education is a key part of our responsibility as parents and those who are now considered to be older than the younger generations, etc. Then he goes on to mention kayfiyat tayammum, how to perform tayammum. And so tayammum is basically using earth in the absence of water for both wudu and ghusl. And again, these things are discussed in more detail in fiqh. And I would highly recommend for someone who has not studied a small text in fiqh to do so. Study a small text in fiqh. Study the madhab of your people, the predominant madhab of your people. If you have no access to the predominant madhab of your people, study the madhab of that which is accessible to you, whether it's a small community that you live amongst, Imam, teacher that you know, etc. Study a madhab. Don't confuse yourself or bother yourself with the various opinions relating to these issues of ibadah. Why? Because the first and foremost purpose and point of education is to implement. So knowing what the Ahnaf have said, what the Hanabila have said, what the Malikiyah have said on a personal level at first is not going to benefit. It's going to confuse. At first, you want to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based upon an accepted opinion, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given acceptance to. And that's the four madhabs, the four schools of fiqh. Whether you study the Hanafi, the Maliki, the Shafi'i, or the Hanbali, they are all following the Quran and the Sunnah. Pick one, study one, worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala according to one. And if you would then like to search for the truth, then develop the tools in order to understand the truth. To know the truth, you have to first understand how to recognize the truth. And that requires years, decades of study. Language, philosophy of law, philosophy of language, hadith, the specifics and technicalities of hadith, etc. It's not something where today, this notion that you can study a book in hadith and suddenly you're able to say what's authentic and what's inauthentic, what's correct and what's incorrect. If it was so simple, why would we have scholarship? If a young person who can't speak Arabic is able to study a book in hadith and suddenly they know right from wrong, why did the ulama study Arabic for 20 years of their lives before studying other sciences? So it's very important that a person studies a madhab for the sake of worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It could be the madhab of a contemporary scholar. For example, a book authored by a contemporary scholar in ibadah. No problem. Why? Because they're going to be referring back to the madhahib anyway. But it's important that a person studies the fiqh of ibadah at least once so that they are worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with understanding of what they're doing. And we should also teach our children this. We should teach our children, if for example, I can study a text and then I can teach it to my children when they get older, alhamdulillah. That's basically the summary of what's mentioned in the abridgment when it comes to at-tahara min al-ahdath, so purification from the ritual states of impurity. And now we'll move on to al-qism al-thalith, at-tanzif an al-fadalat, so purification or cleaning ourselves of that which is considered to be excessive. So he says al-fadalat al-zahira naw'an. So there are two types of things that we need to look at here. Number one, awsakh, so literal dirt. And number two, ajza. So you could say that which is excess to the body, perhaps. So he says, al-naw' al-awwal. So we're not going to go through all of them this evening. We'll go through some. He says, al-naw' al-awwal al-awsakh, wa hiya thamaniya. So he mentions 8 I guess types of dirt that need to be removed from the body. He says, الأول ما يجتمع في شعر الرأس فالتنظيف عنه مستحب بالغسل والترجيل والتدهين. وقد دخل على رسول الله عليه الصلاة والسلام رجل ثائر الرأس أشعث اللحية فقال أما كان لهذا دهن يسكن به شعره ثم قال يدخل أحدكم كأنه شيطان. So look at so this is there are some parts here that we're going to mention which are very important for us to consider today, and we have to be able to hear opinions that perhaps go against the opinions that we have become accustomed to, and we have to develop the ability to think and to evaluate, etc., and that requires contextualization. So he says the first that needs to be cleaned is that which collects in a person's hair. Dirt which collects in a person's hair. How so? فالتنظيف عنه مستحب بالغسل والترجيل والتدهين. And the way that a person will clean his hair is by literally cleaning it, by combing it, and by oiling it. That's for the person who has long hair. For the person who has short hair, they don't necessarily have to oil their hair. But what he's saying is our hair should be presentable. Our hair should be presentable. What is presentable and what isn't presentable? How do we define that? How do we define what's presentable and what isn't presentable? Customs. Goes back to the customs in many aspects. And there's a general principle that we can apply to all customs. A custom can be accepted as long as it does not go against a principle or a point that has been determined by the framework of Islam. For example, if a person starts to wear a cross and says it's the custom, this would be unacceptable. Why? Because the cross is a distinct sign of a particular religion, and it's still practiced. It still has significant meaning within that religion today. So that wouldn't be acceptable. But if a person, for example, were to wear his hair in a certain way, as long as the hairstyle doesn't go against something mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ or mentioned in the Quran, then it's okay. So an example of that, the issue of fade haircuts. It's an issue which is discussed. Why? Because there isn't a specific agreement on what would constitute having part of your hair shaved and part of your hair showing and stuff like that. So we're not talking about the ruling. We're not talking about the hukum here. It's an example. So when it comes to hair, the hair should be presentable, basically, and clean. It should be presentable and clean. And he mentions an athar that the Prophet ﷺ, someone entered upon the Prophet ﷺ and his hair was extremely messy. So the Prophet ﷺ and his beard was extremely untidy, unkempt. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, could this person not find some oil to deal with his hair, basically, to tidy up his hair? And then he said, ثم قال يدخل أحدكم كأنه شيطان. One of you will enter and he looks like he's a shaitan. Why? Because his hair's all over the place and his beard's all over the place. Then he says الثاني ما يجتمع من الوسخ في معاطف الأذن والمسح يزيل ما يظهر منه وما يجتمع في قعر الصماخ فينبغي أن ينظف برفق عند الخروج من الحمام. So he says the second type of dirt which should be removed from the body is the dirt which collects in the ear. And so that which is apparent of the ear can be cleaned, he's saying, by wiping it. And as for that which collects in the inner ear, it should be cleaned when a person leaves the hammam, he says. It should be carefully cleaned and softly cleaned when a person leaves the hammam. What's the hammam? The Turkish baths, basically, which we don't use here. I mean, it's not a custom really, and I would assume because it would soften it up, etc. But the point is, anyway, perhaps you can make your own steam room at home, although I wouldn't recommend it, especially now with the energy bill crisis. But the general point anyway is to clean the ears, that the ears should be clean. And so cleaning our ears when we perform wudu, that's one way, but also paying attention to cleaning our ears and making sure that there is no apparent dirt which has collected and we're not paying attention to our ears. So cleaning the ears is important. الثالث ما يجتمع داخل الأنف ويزيله بالاستنشاق والاستنثار. Second or thirdly, that which collects in the nose. And I'm sure we all know how to clean it. When we perform wudu, we clean our noses. So you can see the hair, the ears, the nose, everything which a person presents to other people should be kept tidy and clean and presentable. And we'll continue. He says, الرابع ما يجتمع على الأسنان وطرف اللسان فيزيله بالسواك والمضمضة. And this one is important. He says that which collects on a person's teeth and their tongue, basically. And they should clean it with siwak and madmada. So they should clean their teeth with the miswak and wash their mouths with madmada. And in fact, there are certain types of food the Prophet ﷺ made dislikable for a person to pray after they've eaten such food, such as onions, garlic, etc. Perhaps if uncooked, some of the ulama, they'll say if uncooked, because when they're cooked, they lose the strong smell. But generally speaking, a person should have good oral hygiene, should clean their teeth, clean their mouth, clean their tongues. And remember, this standard of hygiene came when? Over 1,400 years ago. Over 1,400 years ago. And if you do some research, look into the hygiene practices in places like Europe and what we now know as the Western world 1,400 years ago. People used to literally throw their urine and their excrement out from their windows up until a century or two ago. In fact, in Europe, it was believed that having a bath opens the pores to germs and disease. And people would avoid cleaning themselves. They would avoid cleaning themselves because they thought that it caused harm. So imagine. And don't take my word for it. Look it up. Look it up online. Look at the hygiene standards across the world. It's not only in Europe. And so this is, to some extent, an ayah. It's a sign of the truth of the way of the Prophet ﷺ. I mean, in certain places, people still don't clean themselves properly when they use the bathroom. It's a reality. And then he says, الخامس ما يجتمع في اللحية من الوسخ إذا لم يتعهد ويستحب إزالة ذلك بالغسل والتسريح بالمشط. And he's going to mention something which is very interesting in a second. So he says the fifth place that we should pay attention to, and of course it's for the men, although Allahu A'lam, nowadays it could be for some, I won't say anymore. So that which collects in the beard from dirt. Why does it collect in the beard? Because the beard is not looked after. And he says, so he should basically remove that which collects in the beard of dirt, etc., by washing it and combing it. And some of the ulama, they used to have a comb with them and a small mirror to check their presentation. So this was the practice of the ulama. It's noted that Imam Ahmed used to carry a small mirror with him to make sure that he looked presentable. And then he says, وَهَذَا وَاجِبٌ عَلَى كُلِّ عَالِمٍ تَصَدَّى لِدَعْوَةِ الْخَلْقِ إِلَى اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. So he says, this is something, the above mentioned things, and perhaps specifically when it comes to looking after his beard, his hair, etc. He says, this is something which is wajib upon every person who has studied the religion and he has presented himself to call people to the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Any person who wants to engage in da'wah needs to look after their presentation. He's saying it's wajib. And Imam al-Ghazali, when he uses a term such as wajib, he's not using it lightly. You're talking about a scholar, a recognized scholar, Imam in usul al-fiqh, an Imam in fiqh. In the Shafi'i madhab, you could say he is a cornerstone of the Shafi'i madhab. And he is a cornerstone of usul al-fiqh, the philosophy of Islamic law. And he's saying it's wajib for a person who presents himself for da'wah to take care of their presentation and their physical appearance. And so think about the way we present ourselves, the way that we as Muslims present ourselves in various arenas. that it's something to take into consideration. He says, وَهُوَ أَن يُرَاعِي مِنْ ظَاهِرِهِ مَا لَا يُوجِبُ نَفْرَةُ النَّاسِ عَنْهُ. So how is it that a person should do this? He says that he should take care in that which he presents to the people of himself, so that he doesn't force people to run away from him, so that people are not scared by his appearance. People are not worried by his appearance. People don't look at the person and say, this man looks like a savage. That's a reality. It's a reality. And this is something to think about in so many ways. We could discuss this in so many ways, in so many language. The language that we use. The language that we use has a major impact. The language that we use frames the conversation that we're going to have. What type of language am I using when I'm presenting Islam to others, when I'm speaking to others? What type of body language am I using? What type of clothing am I wearing? So these are things to be considered and discussed. He says, وَالْإِعْتِمَادُ فِي مِثْلِ هَذِهِ الْأُمُورِ عَلَى النِّيَّةِ. And he says that what should be relied upon in these situations is the intention. What does he mean by that? He says, فَالتَّزَيُّنْ عَلَى هَذَا الْقَصْدِ مَحْبُوبٌ. If a person beautifies themselves for this reason, it's something which is commendable. Yeah, if a person beautifies himself for this reason, i.e. for da'wah, it's something which is commendable. But what does that mean though? Beautification in accordance to the framework of Islam. In accordance to the framework of Islam. It doesn't mean that they go against the principles of Islam in the name of beautification. So for example, a brother that goes to the gym, starts wearing extremely tight clothes and says, I'm calling people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No, because that goes against the principle of being modest. Modesty is not only for women, it's for men and women. For example, patterns in the hair and saying I'm doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No, that goes against a principle. Or for example, if a man starts plucking his eyebrows, women shouldn't be plucking their eyebrows, of course. But today, men plucking their eyebrows, men threading their beards. For what? Beautifying myself for the sake of da'wah. That's not beautification. That's going against the framework of Islam. And it's also going against what it means to be a man. So we have to be very careful. And the online scene, this is something which is happening. The online scene. For example, I don't want to make myself laugh, but some of the things that men are doing these days, it's Allah musta'an, it's a joke. Then he says, وَتَرْكُ الشَّعْثِ, and likewise women. So the same can be applied to women. I can't look at this direction because I've seen. Likewise women. So for example, if a woman is calling other women to Islam, calling work colleagues to Islam, she can't beautify herself for that sake and say, yeah, I'm doing it because I want to attract people to Islam. No, of course not. And it's common sense, which if we use, the faculty of understanding that Allah has given us, we know what's wrong and what's right. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the ability to make those judgments. But the problem is when that faculty has been corrupted by the society, which slowly is taking place. And so we have to make sure that we are aware of what's right and what's wrong. And in fact, the ulama of Islam, and don't take my word for it, look at the books of fiqh, they mention that it's disliked for a man, for example, which was mentioned in previous classes, fiqh, it's disliked for a man to cream himself daily. It's disliked for a man to take excessive care of his beard and his hair, etc. Why? Because he loses that which makes him a man. A man should have a sense of manliness about him. If you have a man who doesn't want to jog because he doesn't like to sweat. You have a man who's scared, of a little bit of dry skin here and there. Look at the difference in generations. The older generations were not like that. And the fuqaha, they mentioned this. And this was not only Islam, but likewise in other cultures, in other civilizations. Because when men lose masculinity, it's problematic. Just as when women lose femininity. It's very problematic. And when there's a breakdown of masculinity, you have some of the things that you see today, where if there was danger in the household, the man will probably send a wife rather than try to protect his family, the man will send a wife. And so we have to, the framework, that which defines masculinity for us is Islam. Because as we spoke about, I believe last week, it can be the other extreme. And in Islam, we don't have something called toxic masculinity. We have masculinity defined for us by Islam. That's it. That which the Prophet ﷺ enacted, that the way the Prophet ﷺ acted, the way the Sahaba acted, we consider that to be masculine. That which is contrary to those things, we consider it to be outside of masculinity. And we have to be very careful when we use certain terms. Why? Because when you use a term, you're using the framework that comes with that term. So yes, men should be masculine, but masculinity as defined by the Prophet ﷺ. And the fuqaha are the best of those who derived what that means. For example, we have something in Islam called maru'ah. Maru'ah is, it's like integrity, chivalry perhaps, rujula, masculinity. And likewise we have unutha, femininity. What is it that defines a woman's femininity? How should a woman understand what it means to be a woman? By looking to the best of women, the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, the sahabiyat, and that which the ulama have derived from those individuals. And a very important part of Islam is to accept that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has defined for us. Not the way we feel about things, but that which has been defined for us and given to us of roles and positions and actions and responsibilities. That sometimes is a challenge for some, especially when we're coming from a society which conditions us to think in a certain way. So he says, وَتَرْكُ الشَّعْثِ بِاللِّحْيَةِ إِظْهَارًا لِلزُّهْدِ وَقِلَّةِ الْمُبَالَةِ بِالنَّفْسِ مَحْذُورٌ. A person leaving their beard untidy and unkempt to show that there is a zahid, they've left off the dunya and they don't care about themselves, is something which is haram. It's haram for various reasons. He says, وَتَرْكُهُ شُغَلًا بِمَا هُوَ أَهَمْ مِنْهُ مَحْبُوبٌ. And to leave off your physical presentation, for example, the beard, etc., because you are busier with that which is more important, is something which is commendable. But how do we tell the difference? He says, وَهَذِهِ أَحْوَالٌ بَاطِنَةٌ بَيْنَ الْعَبْدِ وَبَيْنَ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ وَالنَّاقِدْ بَصِيرٌ. These are situations that are only known by the slave himself, i.e. the servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether man or woman, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. And there may be times where a man or a woman doesn't actually have time to look after themselves physically. And so they may end up looking a bit rough, for example, or feeling a bit rough. And if they're doing that because there are more important things to tend to, that's something which is commendable. But if they're doing that because they want to show to people they've left off the dunya, that's something which is wrong. Likewise, if a person is beautifying their presentation in the right way for the sake of calling people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's commendable. But if they're doing it for other reasons which are haram, then of course it's haram. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows the intention. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows the intention. And it's not for us to judge others, but it's for us to understand ourselves and understand that which is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. And on the point of masculinity, femininity, etc., there's another point that should be thought about, for us to think about and perhaps discuss, etc. But some refer to it as the infantilization of adults, where adults are acting like children rather than children acting like adults. And you see this as a trend where adults are dressing like children, speaking like children, behaving like children, rather than children dressing like, speaking like, and behaving like adults. Previously, adults would dress their children up like young adults. They would dress them up like young adults. Now, adults are trying to dress like children. And you see, the older a person gets, you can't make a generalization, but it's become something quite prevalent. The older a person gets, the more younger they try to appear in the way that they dress, the way that they speak, etc. And that's something that we have to be aware of as well, something we have to consider. For example, a grown man playing computer games all day. A grown woman watching whatever it might be that she likes to watch, whatever it might be. It could be the woman playing games and a man watching, whatever the case. Not acting like an adult or a grown man wearing a t-shirt with a cartoon character on it. A grown woman, likewise, wearing clothing that has some sort of print, etc. These things we have to take into consideration. What image do we present of ourselves? And it's not to lay blame to those that have those types of t-shirts. We're talking about a culture. And our role here is what? To think about these things. To think for ourselves about, that which we've accepted as normal. Is it something which should be a practice? Like, if you think about the older generation, would you ever see a man from the older generation walking around with a t-shirt with Mario on his chest? Or, something of the sort? You wouldn't. Why? Because it's a process. And especially for a generation that has been raised upon computer games, TV shows, cartoons, the whole obsession with the Marvel films, where you have now grown adults dressing up like Marvel characters to go and watch a film. There was a film that came out recently, Sonic, and you have grown people dressing like characters from Sonic. And we laugh, but we have Islam. Alhamdulillah, Islam defines for us what's right and what's wrong, etc., and perhaps gives us the ability to think. But for others, but if that's becoming the general practice, we can fall into that. So it's something to consider. Likewise, male obsession with creams, with hairstyles, things like that. These are things to think about. What does it mean to be a man? It doesn't mean you have to look like a brute. But likewise, to constantly be creaming and shaping up the hair and applying this and that, and is that correct? It's always in the middle, the balanced approach. And of course, I can't speak about things that relate to women as well as I can about things that relate to men, because I'm not a woman. So that's the reason why I'm focusing on the men. So we'll conclude with that, inshallah, and open up for discussion, debate, disagreement, reflections. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad.